Hello my dear friends, how are you? I'm Heidr, and today I'm going to talk about Gullveig, this very mysterious female entity of Norse mythology who has gained a considerable religious importance among modern neo-pagan religious manifestations and non-pagan as well. By the way, I hope you have enjoyed the introduction. That's all my voice and myself beating the drum once again. Now, as you know, I may publish videos on Sundays once in a while, in special occasions, but the day of the week when videos always come out in this channel is at Wednesdays. So this is our first Wednesday of October of 2020. So what better way to start this very special and mysterious month and a very strange and out of the ordinary year than with Gullveig, I think. I thought this subject would be a good way to start this month, filled with mystery, magic, and witches are on the loose. Now, before we start, just a couple of things that we need to get on the table so you know what this video will be all about. I am well aware that there is this book called Gullveig-Heiðr book, which has been circulating for some time, and it has been perceived to be the main source on Gullveig. So I've been receiving a lot of questions concerning that book and Gullveig, especially by my patrons who were actually very kind to send me the book so I could read it. Now, everything that shall be said in this video has nothing to do with that book, and none of the information on that book will be exposed in this video whatsoever. I'm not going to make a book review on the Gullveig-Heiðr book, but given the questions I have received, even here on YouTube, I feel it's necessary to share with you just a couple of words, right? So, I read the Gullveig-Heiðr book. I found it entertaining, pretty interesting actually. It's a different perspective as well as a whole other approach to the Norse myths, as well as in terms of modern religious manifestations. But be attentive, because even though I found the book entertaining, it's pretty interesting, and some of the religious expressions in it I also share to a certain extent, I do not consider it a reliable source on the study of Norse mythology and on Gullveig for that matter. And you shouldn't too, and I am almost certain the author of the book is of the same opinion. Again, it's entertaining and it opens up interesting perspectives about the way we perceive things, especially reality, and the entire book is a good way of, or to criticize some of the ideas expressed in Norse mythology, especially when it comes to the prose Edda, and especially the deliberate changes and omissions on the part of Snorre Sturluson. As you know, Snorre's presentation on the mythic material was shaped by his Christian worldviews, and that much is actually quite visible. For example, speaking of Gullveig, the way Snorre omits any explanations of known sacrificial myths expressed in the way the Volva Gullveig defies death. Snorre omitted and changed several things from the myths, several highly important mythical events that would actually express the pagan mind. Because in his own time, the pagan material was just too outlandish already for his Christian worldviews. But as I was saying, I'm almost certain the author of the book, Gullveig-Heiðr book, doesn't consider the work a reliable source of information concerning the pagan world views of the Scandinavian pre-Christian peoples. The author doesn't hide that the book is a very personal view as well as a personal individual system of belief, which is chaos Gnosticism. So it is anti-cosmic Satanism, so not pagan. And the way the author views the giants in Norse mythology as well. If the author wanted to present the pagan mind, especially in relation to Gullveig, the author would have spoken about animistic understandings in pre-Christian Scandinavia, as well as making a thorough work of investigation concerning comparative mythologies, as well as shamanism and shamanic understandings. After all, it is Gullveig we are speaking about. And I do believe that without an understanding of shamanism, especially circumpolar or Arctic shamanism, Gullveig can't be fully understood. Or at least we can't get closer to what might have been the function and meaning of Gullveig. Like I said, not going to make a book review on this one, on the Gullveig-Heiðr book, not in this video anyway, but it is important to make that clear, that the Gullveig-Heiðr book is an entertaining book and a very interesting modern religious expression, and I don't think nothing of the sort was constructed before, which makes it quite unique. But it's not a reliable source, neither on the Norse myths themselves nor on Gullveig herself, which is why in this video all that shall be presented here by myself has nothing to do with that book, right? So, on this video today I'm going to talk about Gullveig, obviously, and I'll make a separation on Gullveig and on the entity she becomes, which is Heidr. This separation isn't because I believe these are different entities, not at all. It's quite clear, according to the written sources, that Gullveig and Heidr are the exact same, but I feel the need to make a separation at some point on the course of this video, so we can focus on the meaning of Gullveig and then on the meaning of Heidr, which is totally different. There is indeed a change of personality, a change of function, and it is important to understand this change, this separation of identity, in order to understand Gullveig as a whole. So, in this way, I shall also speak about the initiation process, which seems to be expressed indeed on Gullveig, as well as speaking about the traditional schema of an initiation ceremony within shamanism, precisely in relation to death and initiation as well, and the resurrection / rebirth. It will also be important to take special notice at the translations from Old Norse into English concerning the Voluspa and the single stanza in which Gullveig appears and how she becomes Heidr. So I will focus on the meaning of these two names, Gullveig and Heidr, and the wrong translations and interpretations, in my opinion, as well as explore the essence of the name Heidr, which will give us a lot of clues. In fact, I believe that is why, precisely, why there has been such a misunderstanding concerning Gullveig, because there's been too much focus on the name Gullveig alone, which appears only once in one single source, and no particular interest on the name Heidr, which appears quite often and in several other sources, and it gives us a lot more clues on the function and meaning of Gullveig and on what she becomes. And just to finalize this introduction, I'm also well aware that Gullveig has been understood to be a goddess from the Vanir tribe of gods, especially among neo-pagan groups and modern religious manifestations. This probably happened because of the belief that Gullveig is a sorceress and therefore works with magic, and that magic is solely the province of the Vanir, which is specifically Seidr. Therefore, she must be a Vanir, but also because Gullveig is perceived to be the goddess Freya herself. perhaps an earlier aspect of Freya, and that she was sacrificed by the Aesir and so on and so forth. So I'm also going to explore that, if Gullveig is indeed Freya or not, because there are a lot of similarities indeed, not just on how and where and when Gullveig is placed in the Norse myths, but also similarities between Freya and the entity Gullveig shall become, which is Heidr. Although it is possible that Gullveig comes from Jotunheimr, which I shall explain further ahead, possibly on a note on the screen, so pay close attention to the notes. Making notes to shorten the time of the video, as always. So, with all of this being said, and I do hope I haven't bored you to death already, with no more delay, please, let's get started. So, let's start with Gullveig and the general panorama we have of her. Even though lately there has been a great emphasis on the figure of Gullveig in some modern neo-pagan religious manifestations, such as Vanothru, Gullveig only appears in one single source, the Voluspa, and in one single stanza, just once. Although this single stanza holds a lot of useful information, and none more so than the next stanza when Gullveig becomes Heidr. But on that one we shall explore further ahead. It's also important to underline that the Voluspa was one of the main sources that gave a considerable amount of inspiration to Snorre Sturluson to compose a great part of the prose Edda in the 13th century, and he deliberately omits and changes several things. We are not certain when the Voluspa itself was created. It was compiled in the 13th century, but its creation probably points to the 10th century, which is an exceptionally important period in Scandinavia in religious terms, a period of religious syncretism, quite noticeable in skaldic poetry, Eddic poetry, as well as burial mounds. Heathens, pagans, incorporating Christian religious understandings and conceptions into their own pagan religious cultural panorama. Whoever created the Voluspa was probably an early Icelander of the 10th century who was a heathen, a pagan most likely, but knowledgeable in Christian religious understandings, as we find a beautifully composed work that expresses this religious syncretism in several points. And as I have said before on other videos, the poet of the Voluspa seems to me to have been an exceptionally intelligent person, as the poet prepares the audience to enter in a poetic world filled with wonderful imagery, in which the main character, a prophetess or a Sorceress, a vulva, is reincarnated or woken up from her deathly slumber, and she remembers the former lives, and her speech presents a third or a secondary personality, which gives the impression that she is accompanied by her tutelary spirit, another female entity attached to the Sorceress, which presents its own experiences. It's a hauntingly beautiful and mystical atmosphere with several hidden details and meanings that have been, I think, highly overlooked. So, Gullveig appears here during the first great war between the gods, between the Aesir and the Vanir. She comes into the hall of the gods, into the hall of Odin, to be more precise, under another of his names, which is Hor, the High One. In there she is pierced with spears and burned 3 times, and no matter how much she is burned, she just doesn't die. Or at least it is impossible to destroy her, as she lives again and again until the 3rd time, when she changes personality, changes her entire existence, and becomes Heidr. In the next stanza. Because Gullveig appears during the legendary conflict between the Aesir and the Vanir, she is often associated with the conflict itself. Among the Aesir, she is pierced by spears, in an attempt to murder her, and then she is burned 3 times. Burnt 3 times and yet twice reborn. The number 3 is particularly interesting in here, which we shall explore further ahead, don't worry. Upon the 3rd attempt to destroy her, she is reborn as Heidr, as a sorceress and practitioner of Seidr, the magical performance of the Volur, of the prophetesses or seeresses of Old Norse pre-Christian society. So when did Gullveig come to the Heidr? Before the war or during the war? It has often been interpreted that the reason why the war between the gods, between the Heidr and the Vanir really starts is actually because the Heidr murdered Gullveig. It is understood that Gullveig at this point in the story belongs to the Vanir tribe of gods, because when she becomes Heidr, she becomes a sorceress. She becomes a practitioner of Seidr, a prophetess or seeress. So it is automatically assumed that when she was Gullveig still, she was already a sorceress, wielding magic, possessor of magic, therefore from the Vanir, since it is said that it was the Vanir gods alone that possessed magic and not the warlike Heidr. So Gullveig is sent to the Heidr for whichever reason, and they murdered her, thus starting the war between the Vanir and the Heidr. But not bloody likely. This is actually important to reflect on, because Gullveig is not a sorceress yet. She only becomes a sorceress when she is reborn after the 3rd and final attempt to kill her, to destroy her with fire. And the sources specifically say that the war is started because Odin and his actions concerning the breaking of an oath and at a sacred council, and not because he murdered Gullveig. It could of course be argued that if Gullveig is Freyja, indeed murdering her would cause the Vanir to go to war. After all, their beloved goddess was murdered. Freyja is a title rather than a name. It means the lady. So under the name of Gullveig, she would have been something else and not particularly the lady of the Vanir. It could also be argued, of course, that in the sources Odin wants the magic of the Vanir, and he goes through great length to achieve what he wants, and throughout the sources he is often a deceiver, and he kills, he murders and destroys many lives to get what he wants. So could it be that Odin's original plan was to invite Freyja under the guise of Gullveig, kill her until she becomes Heidr, a sorceress, and reveals her true nature, her true power, and so Odin is able to possess her magical knowledge, possess Seidr for himself? Gullveig, after becoming Heidr, departs from the home of the Heidr. She becomes a sorceress, and it is said that it was Freyja that indeed taught Odin the art of Seidr after the end of the conflicts, when Freyja is invited to the home of the gods. So we have some parallels here that point to Gullveig being Freyja. But what does Gullveig mean? Many modern scholars have interpreted Gullveig as being a witch, because she sort of becomes one after she is burned. Most have pointed out that the burning of Gullveig represents the burning of a witch, and this was done as some sort of punishment because the goddess was greedy for gold and that she corrupted the women, and so they burned her, and then her people, the Vanir, came to take revenge, start the war. Her name has been often interpreted as being greedy for gold, and as such this somehow justifies her burning as a punishment for her greediness, and she corrupts women because of the translation from the Volospa, when she becomes Heidr, and the translation goes like this, and I quote, "Minds she bewitched that were moved by her magic. To evil women a joy she was." So, we have the interpretation of Gullveig being a witch, burned as a punishment, and on top of that, when she becomes Heidr, a sorceress, a practitioner of Seidr, she corrupts women, and she is the goddess beloved by evil or wicked women. This, my friends, is a blunt modern Christian interpretation and assumption of the Old Norse written sources, and trying to push into the image of Gullveig and her burning linked to the image of the medieval witch itself, from a religious and social point of view and collective consciousness of a society from a time quite different than the Scandinavian pre-Christian past. This interpretation is pure fantasy, as there is nothing whatsoever in the sources that would even hint to such a reason for burning Gullveig, and that she was indeed a witch before she becomes Heidr. The idea that Gullveig means greedy for gold is an interpretation that has stuck since it was proposed in the 1930s, and it's simply wrong. As much as I like Henry Adams Ballow's translations of the Old Norse sources as an example, and indeed he has been the great source of translations of Old Norse material to this day, I find a lot of errors and wrong assumptions in his translations, and we are going precisely to focus on this translation of Gullveig as being greedy for gold. Her name has often been translated to golden drink or golden intoxication, and therefore it was assumed that it is in reference to the madness and corruption caused by this precious metal. As some authors have pointed out, as the personified greed for gold, which seems to be a sorry attempt to forcibly link Gullveig to Freyja, as Freyja, as you know it, is a goddess usually linked to gold, riches and wealth. After all, Freyja means the lady, and she is a goddess associated with nobility. Freyja is closely associated with gold, precious metals and jewels. Freyja is the owner of Brinskamen, which is a piece of jewelry, a bright necklace. And Freyja's daughters are called Nos and Gersini, both meaning jewel. So there is this forced attempt to connect Gullveig with Freyja because of this, and saying that Gullveig is greedy for gold, as in sort of creating a version of Freyja too greedy and poisoned by wealth and power, since she is related to nobility, royalty even. But I just don't buy it. This doesn't mean that there isn't a possible connection between Gullveig and Freyja. There are some parallels way better than this greediness for gold, that's for sure. For instance, as her aspect of Heidr and related to the mead served in Valhalla by a goat with a similar name, which we shall see further ahead, don't worry. But this greediness for gold is just too forced. Gullveig is indeed related to gold, no doubt about that, but it is most likely a kenning. Gullveig means gold brew, or golden drink, or golden strength, or golden power, and it has also been interpreted as golden intoxication. And it is in reference to either the intoxicating drink that leads to ecstasy and deep inspirational power, which Odin indeed goes through a great deal of deception and murder to get his hands on the mead of poetry, Odroirir, or it could either be in reference to the magical golden drink of mead that was offered by a goddess figure as well as by the queen or the lady of the mead hall. In the Viking Age society, the lady of the hall, be that the queen or the wife of a chieftain, was the one serving the mead to the guests, as in showing that hospitality was given, as well as peace, a ritual performance. This is transported to mythology as well, when the Valkyries in Valhalla served the mead to the dead warriors, a supernatural drink to the spirits of dead warriors to keep them bound to that reality and consume a special kind of food that makes these dead mortals something unique apart from all the other dead. And we have iconographic representations of women with horns of drink. Remember that the name Freyja isn't a name at all, but a title, which means the lady. So could it be that Gullveig, meaning golden drink, be actually the mead served by the lady? In this case, Freya serving Odin the mead as an act of hospitality and peace. In the Old Norse society, gold is a metaphor for wisdom, divine light, and poetry actually. The mead of poetry that Odin desperately wants. Odin in the Sorceress is always seeking after great wisdom and inspiration, seeking after the mead of divine inspiration and ecstasy and power. Gullveig in here seems to represent indeed a source of great power that Odin desperately wants, which is probably why Gullveig came to the hall of Odin as a guest, so he could have her power by murdering her. I shall explain this further ahead. Remember the case of how the mead of poetry came to be created from the blood of Kvasir, the wisest of all beings in Norse mythology. Kvasir is killed, his body is destroyed to release his essence, which lies in the blood, and from his blood the great mead of poetry is created, from which Odin drinks and gains incredible knowledge and inspirational power. Kvasir is the vessel of power, the very living container of tremendous power, and he is killed to release that power and be consumed by Odin. Take special notice at this. And for more information on Kvasir, please check my video in this right upper corner precisely concerning this whole event. Now, what exactly happens to Gullveig? She is pierced by spears, she is murdered, and the Aesir attempt to destroy her body with fire. Destroy her physical body the same way Kvasir was destroyed to release his power to be consumed by Odin. So could the burning of Gullveig be a means of destroying her as well as to release her power so Odin may consume it? She was golden power, golden strength in relation to power, wisdom, and divine inspiration. She contained a tremendous amount of power in her that Odin wished to possess, and so he attempts to destroy her. Just like Kvasir and several other figures in the Norse mythology, Gullveig loses her physical body in an attempt to release the spiritual power from within. But it didn't go as Odin planned, for she was reborn from the fire as Heidr, as the archetype of the sorceress, and she fled and slipped through Odin's fingers. So a possible interpretation of this is that not only this myth of the burning of Gullveig demonstrates a second or indeed perhaps an earlier version of the mead of poetry, but it also demonstrates the vision the Old Norse pre-Christian society had towards the Volur, towards the prophetesses or seeresses of Old Norse pre-Christian society. They were seen as women with great power, being the physical embodiment of divine power and magic and divine inspiration that leads to ecstasy. Because indeed Gullveig is destroyed and from the ashes reborn a new entity, a new personality. She is the container of power and she is destroyed to release that power, just like the mead of poetry that was only possible to create by the destruction of a god's physical existence and turning his spiritual force residing in the blood into a drinkable substance that gives tremendous inspirational and divine power to the one who consumes it, Odin. Gullveig is the golden drink, the mead of inspirational power and great wisdom, and that power, through a process of transformation, passing through total destruction by fire of its previous existential matter, becomes a new source of power, a new matter. Gullveig becomes Heidr, a sorceress, a vulva, the mortal woman Sorceress of the Old Norse society, which gives us an understanding of an earlier perception of the vulva being perceived as someone with a direct contact with the gods, because within her lies the divine power, the drink of the gods, the source of ultimate wisdom and inspiration, which is Gullveig. So, The Old Norse prophetess was seen as a semi-divine figure, so not as a mere witch burned as a punishment, as it has been interpreted in the 30s of the past century and carried on until our days, but in fact it's a far more complex and extremely pagan understanding of the supernatural reality and the world of the divine and, well, supernatural power in general. The process of initiation of a container of potential, which by itself is nothing, or rather, it is a source of potential yet to be explored, but through a process of initiation, destruction, and death, the vessel of power becomes something greater. This is death and initiation in shamanism. The person before the initiatory traditional processes to become a shaman, and upon death and rebirth, the personality of the past is destroyed and the person is reborn, often with a new name and a new identity within shamanic communities, precisely. And as such, the person changes personalities, changes lives, and ceases to be the person of the past and becomes the shaman, the spiritual leader. The spiritual leader in many cultures isn't actually seen as male or female, but simply as the shaman, the spiritual leader, a totally different aspect. But more on this shamanic death and initiation further ahead, don't worry. So, I find it wrong the translation of Gullveig-Heiðr being a witch. This is the typical male-centric mentality transported into the academic field, which indeed in the early 20th century the academic world was absolutely governed by men. Always this social construction that women are good for nothing but to take care of the house and bear children, which is why every bloody female figure found in earlier archaeology was considered or interpreted as to be a fertility deity. Because what else? It's a woman, so it must be fertility, because women are only good for procreation, right? If a woman doesn't follow the social norms of a society, that is, if she isn't bound to a man and becomes the good wife, she is automatically labeled a witch, in the sense of being the negative, chaotic, and shameful archetype of the woman who doesn't fit or doesn't follow the social norms and rules. Women being reflected in history with little regard to their importance as individuals of a society. So those who translated the Norse myths in the early 20th century, and such translations carried to this day, and other translators are still guided by these translations, it's simply a modern social construction of the image of women in a male-centric society transported to the Scandinavian pagan past. And because Gullveig-Heiðr isn't the loving wife archetype of peace and fertility, she is automatically assumed to be a witch, and therefore with no value. And as it has been translated, she is beloved by evil and wicked women, implying that all other women that do not follow the social rules are therefore evil and wicked and witches. But that's not what we actually have in the Voluspa. We have a female figure regarded as being extremely important in the Old Norse society. A female figure feared and revered, a great respect is given to her. A female figure of such importance that this extremely old account survived to our days, meaning that this reverence for the figure of the prophetess was still quite noticeable in Scandinavia until quite late. Male-centric views making these poor translations, and not actually views of the Old Norse society towards women. So further ahead, I'll give you my own translation for the first time, because it's not a witch, it is a prophetess, a seeress of great importance to other likewise women. Sorry, but this sort of mentality has had great influence upon the perceptions we have of the cultures of the past, and much has been wrongly interpreted. And these translations of the Voluspa are actually a very good indicator or example of not giving value to women other than the usual reproduction function. And if they fail at that, they are regarded automatically as evil and wicked women and witches. The Voluspa clearly shows one of the functions of specific women in the Old Norse society and regarded as something extremely important. The vulva in this case is being regarded as a semi-divine figure. But more on that further ahead. Now, the Vanir did not attack the Aesir to avenge the murder of Gullveig. On the contrary, it was Odin who started the war by throwing his spear towards his opponent at a sacred council, which means the Vanir and the Vanir and the Aesir came together at the sacred council, and Odin broke the peace, broke the sacred laws of a peaceful meeting by throwing his spear to his opponent in a sacred gathering where violence is forbidden. That was what started the war, and not the burning of Gullveig. I believe the burning of Gullveig in this case is a story of initiation, as I said. Just as Odin later on let himself be pierced by spears and hang in order to achieve secret knowledge of the runes and spell songs, Heidr. Gullveig is also specifically said to have been pierced by spears, just like Odin, but instead of hanging from the world tree, Gullveig is burned. The burning of Gullveig represents an equal process of initiation, but not of a male god, but a goddess, which, through a trial of fire, she can conquer death. That's the point. And afterwards starts her journey as an operating sorceress or seeress, a vulva, under a new name, which is a typical structure of initiation. So in this stanza of the Voluspa, we might actually be in the presence of a process of initiation from the part of the vulva, from the part of women, practitioners of magic, Heidr, specifically related to prophecy within the Old Norse pre-Christian society. Some initiation by fire, destruction of identity, and being reborn with a new name, a new personality, a new identity, and a totally new function. Abandoning their former lives, stop being the novices and becoming the sorceresses, the Volur. Gullveig represents the novice, the raw power yet to be explored, yet to be opened up and discovered and released. Which is why Gullveig is the golden drink, the golden power, that which will wake up the power within, the very source of inspirational power. And then Gullveig becomes Heidr, the sorceress, the practitioner of Heidr, the vulva. This isn't unheard of. There has been a great deal of processes of initiation by shamans through fire, through the use of fire, or just the symbolic act of jumping through or walking by fire, which was also considered the first process of initiation, the first step that starts the journey towards becoming a shaman, which is actually still visible nowadays in many folk traditions and practices and beliefs, jumping the fire at specific celebrations of transition of a period or transition of a life cycle, jumping above the fire as a sign of adulthood. Upon reaching a certain age and initiating into a new life, Gullveig is the novice, the goddess representative of the women initiating into the art of prophecy. Gullveig becomes Heidr after she is reborn, and as such, the process of initiation is completed. So, let's explore death and initiation in shamanism. Just a few words, of course, to give you a simple general understanding before we jump into Heidr and her meaning and function, because indeed, between Gullveig and Heidr, there is a whole process of initiation, destruction, and death and rebirth. So let's see, please. All right, death and initiation in shamanism. I'll be using the terms shaman and shamanism for a general understanding, right? But as you well know, shaman comes from the Tungusic language to specifically express their spiritual leader. Other cultures have their own names and terms for their spiritual leaders and for this activity as well. So whenever possible, I will always use the correct terms if I speak about specific cultures. But for a general talk on this subject, I'm afraid I must use shaman and shamanism simply to point out universal parallels in tribal animistic spiritualities. Now, in every activity in life, we start off completely ignorant of our personal power and potential. Our cognitive capacities lie on a dormant state, and they need an impulse, they need knowledge to wake up our senses. And the more we learn, obviously, the more knowledgeable we are and we become. In any activity, we start as an apprentice, beginner, initiate, and we develop and evolve and become knowledgeable in that subject until we become professionals, specialists, experts. The same thing happens in shamanism. Not everyone becomes a shaman, an actual shaman, not a Facebook shaman. The choice isn't really of the person, but it comes from the supernatural, a calling, or a choice not of the person, but of a supernatural nature. The person is chosen, becomes the candidate, and there is a revelation to the person, or a series of revelations upon the very moment the person is chosen to become a shaman. Gullveig is the golden drink, the golden power, in reference to the substance of inspirational power, the substance that leads to ecstasy. Therefore, it is the revelation of the soon-to-be shaman in itself. This inspirational power that leads the mind to transcend, this substance the Old Norse people called the mead of poetry, Old Norse, the drink of the gods, a fermented ceremonial drink, as I've explained precisely in the video about Kvasir. This drink leads to ecstasy, and ecstasy leads to a transcendental state of the mind that reveals what is often hidden from the ordinary mind. Gullveig becomes Heidr, becomes the vulva, the sorceress, the practitioner of Heidr, to be more precise. And Heidr was mainly a divination art. The vulva is the seeress, the prophetess, so in and out of conscious process, it is revealed to the prophetess things of the past and things of the present, but also things of the future. Prophecy. It is a process of revelation. The voluspa is precisely the revelations of the vulva, the revelations of the prophetess, which from start to finish speaks of things of the past, present and future events. But Gullveig is the novice, and such power has not yet been awakened in her. Just the same way the shaman candidate doesn't have any power. But a revelation is given and the person starts the process of initiation to become a shaman. There is an impulse to activate the potential yet to be explored. Gullveig is the inspirational drink, the impulse to activate the unexplored inner potential, the raw power and potential. It is the first revelation of the women beginning their process to become prophetesses, to become volur. In shamanism, it is usually sickness, dreams, and ecstasies in themselves that constitute an initiation. So it is curious that Gullveig comes to the Heidr, she comes to the gods, she comes to the divine. So she has her first contact with the divine, which in itself makes Gullveig the very ecstasy or revelation and the first contact with the supernatural, which reveals and begins the process of initiation. Gullveig is the mortal young female novice aiming to become a prophetess. The ecstasies, sickness and dreams are the pre-choice of the individual, that which will lead the candidate to become a shaman into initiating the very process to become a shaman. So, with this understanding, Gullveig is the calling, the initiation in itself, the revelation, the prerequisite to become a prophetess, the very first stage that will later on lead the individual to become a professional in that art. Gullveig is the determinative ecstatic experience in shamanism that reveals that the person has been chosen to become a shaman, a choice against that person's will. That's a universal parallel in shamanism. It's not a personal choice of the individual, but a choice out of the control of the individual, which leads to suffering, pain, death, and rebirth. Unwillingly suffering. Gullveig comes to the gods and she is pierced with spears and burned. You think she would come willingly, knowing the suffering that she would have to endure? Or maybe she already knew through the revelation itself and she came willingly to suffer so she could learn and become the powerful prophetess. This is why it is particularly interesting the number of times she is burned until she is reborn with a new identity. Her old identity is forcibly destroyed until she assumes a new identity when the process of initiation and all the trials are completed and she finally becomes Heidr. She becomes the sorceress, the vulva, the prophetess, the seeress. 3 times she is burned, and this reflects the exact 3 stages of initiation in shamanism, which are suffering, death, and rebirth, all of which are explicitly symbolized in stanza 21 of the Voluspa. Suffering, death, and rebirth, pierced by spears, burned, and reborn. Within shamanism, all the ecstatic experiences that determine the future shaman's vocation involve the traditional arrangement of an initiation ceremony. Suffering, death, and resurrection or rebirth. The suffering corresponds to initiatory tortures, the psychological isolation of the candidate, of the beginner, as well as the physical torture through self-inflicted injuries and starvation and exposure to the elements. This is the isolation and ritual solitude of initiation ceremonies, and the imminence of death. Death always so close to prepare the initiate, to be aware of the cost to get close to death, because only by seemingly physical death, through sickness, will the individual become a shaman, and not before. Pain and unconsciousness recalls the symbolic death represented in almost all initiation ceremonies within shamanism. So far we have Gullveig coming alone into the realm of the gods, the psychological isolation of the initiate, as well as the isolation sought by the candidate to become a shaman, and isolation from its society. And Gullveig indeed leaves her society, whatever it was. She comes alone, and she then proceeds to be pierced by spears in the hall of the gods within sacred space of the divine, the symbolic torture, pain and imminent death, the self-sacrifice. Certain physical sufferings find their exact counterpart in terms of symbolic initiatory death, for instance. The dismemberment of the body of the candidate, of the beginner that will become the shaman. I have spoken about dismemberment in shamanism precisely in that video concerning Kvasir, and I really don't want to repeat myself for your sake and for the sake of this video, so we don't have to extend this too much. But dismemberment of the body in shamanism is an ecstatic experience that is part of the initiation of the shaman. It is a terrible suffering the initiate has to deal with from the part of the spirits. The point of dismemberment of the spirit is precisely to destroy the spirit of the initiate. The spirits dismember the body, the spiritual body, dismember the spirit of the shaman, destroy it, and reshape it, remake the spirit. The remaking of the spirit of the future shaman is precisely because the previous spirit, the previous mind and consciousness of the initiate wasn't suitable for the work of shamanism and the future contact with the spirits and the supernatural. A new spirit is made suitable for the future work of the shaman, and the new spirit is given to the shaman, a new spiritual body, a new spiritual identity. Please do watch that video on Kvasir where I explore in more detail and depth this shamanic dismemberment. The point here is that Gullveig goes through the same process, the destruction of her body by fire, 3 times until she is ready, until the old spirit, old mind, old self, old identity is completely destroyed without a single trace of her past life, so she can have a new identity and a new function, a new spirit that will lead her to finally complete the process of initiation to become the vulva, to become the prophetess. Just the same way the shaman's spirit is destroyed, mutilated, dismembered by the spirits themselves, and a new spirit, a new spiritual person and identity is born, the spirit that will precisely give the proper conditions for the shaman to do its shamanic work. The abandonment of the old identity, the old life, and entering this new life of a shaman. The acceptance of new identity. Shamanic dismemberment of the spiritual body of the shaman, followed by a renewal of the internal organs and viscera. And from that moment, the shaman ascends to the realm of the gods or spirits, has a dialogue with them, and then the shaman proceeds into descending to the underworld and has conversations with the spirits and the souls of dead shamans. Various revelations, both religious and shamanic. This is the entire process of Gullveig, visiting the realm of the divine, the spirits, going through isolation, torture, death, destruction or dismemberment, and the replacement of spirit and identity, and she is reborn or resurrected with a new identity, Heidr. There's a total disintegration of personality. And then she flees the realm of the Aesir, wandering the lands as Heidr, the prophetess, just as the shaman wanders in different spiritual realms and reveals prophecy as well as other things within shamanism. So, there are shamanic parallels in Gullveig, which may represent an entire initiatory process by the women who were chosen to become prophetesses, sorceresses. This entire pain, suffering, isolation, dismemberment, death, and so on and so forth within shamanism is expressed by a series of initiation ceremonies and ecstatic experiences, and the account on Gullveig seems to express those same ceremonies and experiences and finally being consumed by fire, symbolically as a process of completion of the initiation. So if there was any patron deity of the initiate women to become Volur, that would be Gullveig. And the patron deity of the Volur as professionals and no longer novices, that would be Heidr, the new identity of the former Gullveig, after the completion of all the trials and ceremonies. Mind that Freyja is specifically the Old Norse goddess of Heidr. But as was said before, Freyja is a title, meaning lady. It is true that in the Old Norse society, women played an important role in religious ceremonies, and the great festivities and the ceremonies were held by the nobility. So many priestesses would also have been of nobility. The lady of the hall serving mead and other several ceremonies to the public and to the subjects. So Freyja is the lady, the goddess of Heidr, and cult and ritual and ceremony among nobility and royalty, and much beloved by Old Norse ordinary people as well. But the Volur, the prophetesses, were women apart from the Old Norse societies, certainly not from nobility, certainly not ladies in the sense of being a title of the noble women. Throughout the Old Norse written sources, the Volur, prophetesses, sorceresses, as well as Seitkonur, women practitioners of Heidr, were not actually loved or wanted by the Old Norse society. They were both revered and feared, just like the shaman was. And just like the shaman, they were kept apart from the society, which makes it possible that the Volur were not actually Old Norse women, but prophetesses from foreigner cultures, most likely Sami and Finns, and later on natives of Greenland. What I'm saying here is that Freyja is the goddess of Heidr, but being tied to the nobility and royalty and of the Old Norse society, could never be a goddess appreciated by the Volur. So we either have Gullveig-Heiðr as their goddess of Heidr, or there was only one goddess of Heidr, which was named Freyja, but a totally different aspect of her, a totally different archetype of her, was specifically created to specifically make the social and religious distinctions in the Old Norse society between the priestesses of Freyja and the noble women who took part and held ceremonies and ritual from the wandering prophetesses that did not belong in the Old Norse society, but they too were related to Heidr. It's possible that the Old Norse written sources speak of Heidr as a general term for magic. When the sources were written, it was during an historical time no longer pagan, as the sources were written mostly by either Christian men or men aware of Christian religious conceptions, as well as poets composing works for Christian nobility. So the understanding of Heidr by Christian men was not the same as for pagans. It's possible that to Christians, Heidr was simply yet another term to refer to magic in general. So if that is the case, Freyja is the goddess of Heidr, but Heidr here used as a term to designate the magical arts, cults, and rituals of the pagan nobility of the past, and not the Heidr of the Volur, of the prophetesses. It's possible that in pre-Christian Scandinavia, there was a clear distinction between the magic of Freyja and the magic of the Volur. But under Christian religious understanding, Heidr became the general term to designate all sorts of magic, which is why Christian Icelanders understood Heidr to be evil magic, whilst Galdr was an acceptable type of magic, because Heidr, by Christian understanding, was the magic of women in general, be that nobility or the wandering prophetesses. So if during pagan times there were clear distinctions and different understandings of types of magic, which there were, it's possible that Freyja was specifically the goddess of the magic, cult and ritual performed by nobility, as well as the fertility rituals of the ordinary Old Norse people in pagan times, which by Christian hands was labeled Heidr as a general term for magic, cult and ritual of the pagans. And that Gullveig/Heiðr was the actual goddess of Heidr, the goddess of the prophetesses, the goddess of divination, since Heidr is specifically divination. Because the sources never say that Freyja is the goddess of the Volur, of the Sorceresses, but solely the goddess of Heidr, the art performed by the Sorceresses. So how can Freyja be the goddess of Heidr, but not actually the goddess of the women who actually practiced Heidr? Please, read the note below, because Freyja may have been linked to the Heidr performed by the nobility and not by the wandering prophetesses, which means Freyja was the goddess of the Heidr, of noble women, but never the goddess of the wandering Volur, because the wandering Volur, prophetesses, were not part of the Old Norse society and certainly not from nobility. They were foreigners, probably Sami women, so Freyja was not their goddess, and their goddess was Heidr, which in fact Heidr is tied to the word heath and heathen, precisely those who live beyond the border and not within. We shall see this further ahead. Don't worry. Pay close attention. What I'm saying here is that it doesn't make sense Freya being the goddess of Heidr, because Heidr was the art of divination, and Freya is specifically a goddess of peace, wealth, plenty and fertility, and Heidr was never about fertility or anything actually connected to Freya, because Heidr was a divination art. The fact that in the sources Freya is called the goddess of Heidr and the goddess that gave Heidr to Odin, it's because it is a Christian understanding most likely, and Heidr in here is used as a general term to describe the magic of the pagans in general. So the actual goddess of Heidr would have been Heidr, the reborn Gullveig, and in this sense Heidr is a foreigner goddess of the foreigner prophetesses that wandered about the countryside. Which is why it is said within the Voluspa that Gullveig comes from outside the realm of the gods, and it has often been interpreted as being a Vanir goddess, but doesn't make sense because the Vanir are gods of specifically peace and plenty and fertility, and Gullveig/Heidr isn't related to fertility at all, but in fact to divination and prophecy, which doesn't make her one of the Vanir, but in fact one of the Jotnar from the Jotunheimr, a giantess, which I'm sure you have already read the note below by now. And we shall see further ahead that there are two other figures from Jotunheimr, female giantesses, that bear close parallels with Heidr. Jotunheimr in here is always seen as an outlandish realm, a realm of magic and trolls and giants, specifically magical beings outside the border of the orderly world of the gods, precisely the actual physical border between the Old Norse society and that of the cultures the Old Norse people considered them to be wizards and sorcerers and trolls in the sense of possessing magic. Finland and Sapmi. And that was Jotunheimr, the realm of the Volur, of the prophetesses. But more on it further ahead. In any case, returning to initiation and death in shamanism, the thrice burned and thrice reborn aspect of Gullveig seems indeed to represent the three chief initiatory themes in shamanism, which are suffering, death, and rebirth. But the number 3 in shamanism in initiation processes is also recurrent in circumpolar shamanic cultures, as the future shaman usually has this symbolic death and lies in the yurt, for instance, for 3 days without eating or drinking, completely isolated from any contact with humanity or the world itself. And the future shaman goes through the ceremonies 3 times, during which he or she suffers all the time and experiences the symbolic ceremonial torture, pain, and dismemberment. So it's pretty interesting, Gullveig being burned 3 times and 3 times reborn, specifically. And in the past 100 years or so, this has been overlooked and completely ignored, and only focusing on the fact that she's a witch getting burned as a forcibly concocted punishment. Transporting the medieval witch and the religious collective consciousness of the late Middle Ages and modern period into Old Norse poem, which is absolutely impregnated, saturated with hidden pagan imagery and conceptions. Anyway, what is also clear is death and resurrection or rebirth from the part of Gullveig, which indeed it all goes down to that in the essence of initiatory processes. Ceremonies implying passage from one age group to another, perhaps, or admission into some secret society, change of identity, change of life, always with a series of rites that can be summarized in the formula death and resurrection of the initiate or the candidate or novice or beginner. All the rituals and ordeals are designed to make the initiate forget the past life. That's the point. This is why when an individual, upon becoming a shaman and returns to the place of birth and its community, the shaman acts as if it had lost its memory and has to be taught all over again to walk, eat, and dress. Usually the novices learn a new language and have a new name, just like Gullveig becoming Heidr. I find it curious and very amusing as well, the idea that no matter how many times the gods try to kill and destroy Gullveig, she simply doesn't die. She conquers death. She defies death itself. This is a pretty interesting because in Norse mythology, the gods can be killed and they die, and during the end of a cycle of existence at Ragnarok, most gods are indeed killed and die. And throughout the entire Norse myths, many divine or semi-divine entities die and cease to physically exist, or are transformed into something else. But Gullveig is the only Old Norse mythological entity or figure that escaped death. She conquered death. Even Balder himself dies and goes into the underworld and is resurrected in the end, but he dies. He actually dies. He goes into the realm of the dead, but not Gullveig. She simply defies death. The actual death is of the identity and being reborn with a new identity. Whilst Balder may resurrect, but he has the same identity in the end. And I find it amusing because the initiatory theme composed by suffering, death, and resurrection or rebirth is found in all mysteries and the overwhelming inner experiences that precede a mystical vocation, and among all sorts of peoples from primitive or archaic societies of the past and in their stories. And to this day, actually, we can always see the same psychological basic commitment, which is seeking to conquer death by transforming it into a rite of passage. So death in many religions, spiritualities, and mythologies of the past, and to this day as well, was never regarded as the end, but as a rite of passage, a supreme initiation, as the beginning of a new spiritual existence. And in my opinion, this is perfectly noticeable in Gullveig, this psychological commitment and death being simply a beginning to a new spiritual existence. In this aspect, Gullveig/Heidr is certainly a very archaic spiritual conception. So this entire commitment to express death as an initiation is reflected not only in shamanism but cosmological myths as well, and every kind of social religious action that expresses this theme over and over again as a form of reenactment or indeed recreating movement, regeneration, and the continuation of existence perpetually, as it is seen in the very cycle of nature. Now let's speak about Heidr, the second personality, or indeed the new personality of Gullveig after being reborn, or perhaps we should call it a second birth. Indeed, it's very curious to notice that both in archaic societies as well as modern societies, where shamanism plays an important role in the religious and spiritual lives of such people, there is this perception that the initiation of a person to become a shaman is a sacrifice till the end, a self-sacrifice, and after that the person is reborn, a new person with more power, semi-divine even, and this is noticeable in many mythologies and some religions as well. The self-sacrifice of Odin, the self-sacrifice of Christ, death and resurrection, as we previously spoken, the returning of a new and better individual, reaching enlightenment and superhuman power, the Indian sacrifice, the solitary spiritual path within Hinduism and Buddhism, death and resurrection all over again. It's always an idea to obtain heaven after death, or residence among the gods after death, or to obtain the quality of a god. In other words, through sacrifice, the individual creates a superhuman condition for himself or herself. There is an initiation, a process of self-sacrifice, leading to death and resurrection or rebirth. Again, the same formula we have spoken earlier: suffering, death, and rebirth. And this is precisely what happens to Gullveig. She isn't a goddess when she is a Gullveig. She isn't even a sorceress. But through suffering, death, and rebirth, she is reborn with a new identity. She gains the supernatural condition, and only by becoming Heidr, she indeed becomes a sorceress and ascends to the category of divinity, or at the very least, semi-divine, as a parallel with the figure of the shaman. It's really important to say this again. Gullveig isn't a sorceress. She was interpreted as a sorceress, as a witch to be more precise, because as Heidr, she is a vulva. She becomes a sorceress. And for modern Christian understandings, the vulva was no more than a witch. It seems clear to me that the Gullveig myth represents a sacrificial rite, a rite of purification even, but also self-sacrifice. It's quite clear that Gullveig only becomes a sorceress after her threefold rebirth under the name of Heidr. Heidr, as an adjective, means bright, light, and clear, which again was assumed to be in reference to gold, since Gullveig is linked to gold, but this brightness, light, and being clear seems to support what I've said concerning the initiatory process of self-sacrifice leading to suffering, death, and rebirth, coming out of it with a new identity, a second birth, a wiser person, enlightenment, to have a clear perspective after the revelations that led to this new state of existence, all pointing to the figure of the shaman and the process to become a shaman. But Heidr has other meanings, so let's see about that as well. Unlike Gullveig, which only appears once and in one single source, the name Heidr occurs in other sources, not just within the Voluspa. Heidr is also the very specific name of a seeress, precisely on both the written sources Landnámabók as well as Hrossagakráka. This term occurs throughout the sources as both a category of sorceresses, and as a personal name specifically related to the Volur, the seeresses or prophetesses of Old Norse society. As a noun for sorceress, Heidr occurs in a total of 66 times in the prose sources at least. As a personal name, it is found twice in the Eddic poems, both in Hyndluljóð and as a new name taken by Gullveig in the Voluspa. The interesting aspect about the name Heidr in prose works is that it is 99% related to women who do prophecy. It would seem that only one single woman named Heidr in the sources does not actually have a link to prophecy, but all the other ones are clearly connected to prophecy, and on top of that, there seems to be a connection between these Heidr and the far north, perhaps most likely with the Sami. I've already pointed out before that it is quite possible that the Volur, the seeresses or prophetesses, were not actually members of the Old Norse pre-Christian society, as they always seem to be wandering women from far away, beyond the borders, and almost always regarded as evil, strange, foreigner, outlandish. They were not at all accepted within the Old Norse society at all, and were usually called upon or sought after in the countryside or in other places outside continental Scandinavia, for instance, in Iceland and Greenland, but also Sápmi and Finland. In fact, both the Sami and the Finns are always regarded as wizards and sorcerers and trolls, and most evil sorcerers or any person linked with magic and sorcery in the Old Norse written sources almost always comes from either Sápmi or Finland, outside the Old Norse society, from the northern regions. So what we may be dealing with here are actually women who are closely related to shamanism, but not actually shamans, because in Sami culture, shamans are usually men. So these women may be indeed outcasts from their own native lands, and not welcomed either within the Old Norse society of the past or in their own native lands, which is why they do prophecy and are seeresses but never actually incorporated into a society and always wandering about. The Old Norse called these women volur, singular for vulva, the seeress or prophetess, but the name Heidr might actually have served as a title for them, specifically for the women who became seeresses after their initiation process. Each woman that had succeeded was a Heidr, a sorceress. Bear it with me for a moment. Let's take a look at the Voluspa again, stanza 22, just after Gullveig, when she becomes Heidr. Let me present you three translations for at least for the last part of the stanza in question. First one says that minds she bewitched that were moved by her magic, to evil women a joy she was. We have seen this before. Second one, in a trance she practiced Seidr and brought delight to evil women. Third, Seidr she practiced, possessed, she was ever the darling of an evil wife. These three translations agree in two important things: that Heidr is a practitioner of Seidr and she is revered, beloved, or venerated by evil women. Now, the last point, evil women, is specifically interesting, and in my opinion, the three translations failed in one crucial thing. The Old Norse phrase illrar brudar, which has been translated to evil women or wicked women or evil wife, brudar literally means brides. Not any sort of women, but brides. And Heidr in here presented as Heidr means indeed bad, evil, malevolent, unpleasing, and ugly. So it's quite the negative meaning. But why brides? What exactly is a bride? Traditionally speaking, a bride is a virgin before the ceremony of marriage, which itself is a rite of passage of sorts. It is a ceremony or ritualistic religious ceremony when a woman leaves behind her former life and becomes a bride, and then she becomes a wife. We are speaking here in traditional mentalities of the past, right? A bride is a virgin, technically. She's a maiden, and when she gets married, in past traditions and still in many cultures to this day, of course, upon marriage, the bride becomes the wife. She's attached to a man, she loses her former life, her former family and place of birth, she changes identity by accepting the name of the husband, being part of a new family, a new life, creating her own family. She starts as a bride, a maiden, pure and clear, and through the rite of passage of the ceremonial initiation of marriage, she becomes the wife of someone, and therefore she is no longer a maiden when the marriage is consummated. I'm sure you understand where I'm getting at. Gullveig was the initiate, the maiden, the virgin, the purity and naivety of the young maiden before any initiation ritual, before being incorporated into anything. Through her trial, self-sacrifice, through suffering, death, and rebirth, she becomes Heidr. She is no longer the maiden, no longer the young, naive, and pure girl. She becomes a woman and she becomes a sorceress. So why is Heidr beloved by evil brides? I believe it is in the sense of being beloved by maidens, by the young girls on the place of Gullveig, initiating their process to become sorceresses, prophetesses, seeresses. Heidr is their goddess, their patron goddess, their teacher to whom they look up to. Heidr is the goddess of the initiates, of the maidens, of the future sorceresses, if they pass all the trials, all the rites of passages, the entire initiatory process to become prophetesses. Why are they evil brides or evil maidens? Because they are not supposed to marry. They are eternally the brides, the maidens, untouched by man, quite possibly as one of the restrictions so they can become prophetesses, eternally uncorrupted by sexual intercourse. This is why they are evil brides or maidens, because they are not suitable to be wives. They are unwanted, unpleasing. It's a restriction, and men of the Old Norse society probably knew it, so they were not allowed to touch these maidens chosen to be prophetesses. It was probably both a crime and also a great stigma in the Old Norse society, and probably among the Sami as well. Uncorrupted, unblemished, virgins, eternal maidens. Remember that Heidr also means bright, light, and clear. So this is what makes these women different than the other practitioners of any sort of magic within Old Norse society. Among them, it was taboo to have sexual intercourse and get married and even have a life with another person and being integrated within a society. This has many parallels with many different cultures in which virgin women were chosen to be prophetesses. Take the example of the Greek Pythia, the ancient Hellenic high priestess of the Temple of Apollo in Delphi. She was a virgin and an oracle, a prophetess, a seeress. Of course, this is just one interpretation I came about as usual. I may be crucified by the academic panorama, but I'm past caring about it. I was going to actually call this video Gullveig, the Virgin Prophetess, and I'm almost certain I would receive pretty bad comments from people who would not reach this far on the video. But instead, it's the Maiden Prophetess, the same thing, but not too obvious. Well, not the prophetess yet, but the initiate maiden. Gullveig is the initiate, the maiden, the archetype of the maiden goddess, the raw, pure, clear and naive young girl who then, through an initiatory process of suffering, death and rebirth, becomes the woman, the wise woman, the prophetess. In this way, Gullveig/Heidr is hardly Freya, but there are parallels I want to talk about next. The etymology of Heidr is pretty interesting, and it may actually indicate that the tradition of the vulva is something very, very ancient in the north. Heidr, in its etymology, is related to specific spaces, an open space without boundaries, uninhabited, therefore wild and without order, an open place without trees. This space in modern English is called a heath, related to heathen, those who live in the heath, a wide treeless area with low-growing vegetation, usually with infertile soils, the type of place that is never chosen to be inhabited. Heidr comes from Old Norse Heidin, which is heathen precisely, the term used to describe pagans, the heathens. So the term Heidr would mean something close to the individual who belongs or lives outside the boundaries of society, within the old boundaries, the wild boundaries, beyond the limit of the civilized world, in the sense of being away from the orderly social construction, and therefore a person tied to the wild places and the laws of nature, the old laws, the old boundaries, a heathen. This is the vulva, the Heidr, the prophetess or seeress, who is an outcast. She belongs to the old ways, the old gods, even the older gods before the Norse gods we often hear about. The vulva was regarded as a wandering woman, going from place to place, from homestead to homestead, to give prophecy, never truly belonging to the society and kept on the outside, beyond the boundaries of the orderly society. This is a particularly interesting point, this one wandering about and going from place to place, because, as you remember, the stanza on Heidr within the Voluspa specifically says, and I quote, "Bright Heidr they called her. At all the houses she came to, a good seer of fair fortunes." So the vulva, the Heidr, the heathen prophetess, would go from house to prophesy. So it's curious that Heidr, in some written sources, has other connotations or other meanings as well, such as radiance, golden light, honor, and payment. And in here, there may be a connection with actual gold, or at least some precious item as a form of payment, a promised payment, and it is a question of honor to give this payment to the vulva. This may be a reflection of the rewards given to the volur, to the prophetesses, and the welcome to a certain extent and hospitality that was given to them at the homesteads where they would come to prophesy. In Old Norse sources, the items and clothing of the volur are usually richly made, expensive clothing and jewelry and such other items, which may be the rewards given for the gift of prophecy given to someone who was willing, given by someone who was willing to pay handsomely for her prophecy. To finalize this video, I would like to express a few more notes. In fact, I could go on for several hours, but this is already getting too long. We have the idea of Gullveig being related to the mead, the sacred drink, and a possible connection with Freyja. I've spoken about the account Heidr, where Heidr appears as a name. Hyndla, the main character of Heidr, is the dead vulva, the dead Sorceress, whom Freyja wakes from her death, from her burial, to have her speak of the past. Hyndla sings her song of sacred ancestry, and then Freyja proceeds into asking of Hyndla to give the ale of memory to Ottar, so that he can remember her words. Doesn't matter. The point here is that Hyndla is in possession of a drink related to memory, especially in relation to past lineage, which seems to be in reference to an intoxicating drink that helps to reach the events of the past, prophecy. However, Hyndla refuses to give this drink to Ottar, and she specifically tells Freyja to run off into the night like the goat Heidr runs with the rams. Further ahead, Hyndla repeats the comparison of Freyja and Heidr, adding that Freyja runs wildly about, full of desire, and that many are those who have run about her skirts. This appears to be very insulting and Freyja does not take it lightly, and Freyja threatens to burn Hyndla, literally burn her with fire. It's certainly interesting, this aspect of burning the vulva, just like Gullveig was burned. But Hyndla isn't afraid. She is a vulva already. Therefore, she has already passed through that, through the trials. She has already been burned. So, could Hyndla be Gullveig? No, not likely. But she's a vulva, and she passed through suffering, death, and rebirth already. She has completed her initiation and the symbolic destruction of her former identity through fire. So she is unafraid of Freyja's threats. However, what's more interesting than this in this account is the comparison between Freyja and Heidr, which, as you can see, the first part of the name is very similar to Heidr. In Valhall, warriors are served mead by the Valkyries, mead milked from the goat Heidr, who stands on the roof of Valhall, eating from the great tree, the world tree itself. The mead that the Valkyries give to the dead warriors in Valhall comes directly from the tree of life itself, eaten by the goat Heidr, who then proceeds into giving mead, certainly with special properties, since the goat eats directly from the tree of life, the great world tree Yggdrasil, that sustains all life. So it's particularly interesting, Freyja being compared with the goat Heidr, who runs off into the night. Freyja is being compared to an animal which bears close parallels in name with Heidr, and produces the divine mead, the divine drink that is also in relation to Gullveig, the supernatural divine drink. The goat Heidr seems to be a metaphor for an entity whose function is to transform the matter of the tree of life into a drinkable substance. The tree of life that is watered by the Norns every day from the water of the well of Mimir, the well of wisdom. The Norns give water that contains all the knowledge of the world and the cosmos, all the information of the past, present and future, and give it to the magical tree of life, which Heidr, the goat, eats and produces the magical substance, the mead, the intoxicating drink, a final product with all the potency of the waters of wisdom and the pulsating life of the world tree. The intoxicating drink that induces an ecstatic state of mind. The substance consumed to achieve an altered state of mind, communicate with the supernatural and gather wisdom from the spirits, just like the shaman and possibly just like the vulva, because it's Heidr that produces the substance. I cannot help to think that Gullveig is the raw substance, the golden drink, the mead of poetry, if you will, as previously spoken, and then she becomes Heidr, the wise woman, the prophetess, who went through all that process into achieving a superhuman condition, a divine state or semi-divine, having contact with the divine and the supernatural, and being Heidr, the goat. It is the power of the vulva of producing magic by both the contact with the underworld, waters of wisdom, and from the tree of life itself that connects all the spiritual realms in an animistic understanding. Freya is compared to the goat Heidr, therefore compared to a vulva of great power that runs off into the night, which seems to be in reference to the idea that Old Norse Volur would run into the night, precisely. I'm not going to develop on this video about the night ride of the witches and the witch ride of the Old Norse women. I will leave that for a future video, but indeed we have plenty of Old Norse sources speaking about the night rides of witches and the Volur. So the goat Heidr is indeed a powerful vulva, a powerful witch, and Freya is compared to her. So of all those assumptions to forcibly try to connect Gullveig with Freya, it's actually in the poem Hyndluljóð that Freya is connected to the second identity of Gullveig, which is Heidr. But this doesn't mean Freya is Heidr or Gullveig. It only means that Freya is being compared to Heidr, to a powerful vulva, the very goddess of the Volur, the prophetesses, the prophetess goddess, and Freya herself being the goddess of Seidr, the art of prophecy itself. So it's pretty curious, these little subtle details that tells much more than what they seem, and we really have to be attentive to what is being said when it comes to Old Norse mythology. People may laugh at a goat giving mead for the spirits of dead warriors to drink, but behind this there's so much more, as we have seen. Also, just another point in relation to the night ride of the witches or the Volur. There have been some attempts to link Gullveig with both Angrboda and with Hyrrokin. As you know, Angrboda is a giantess with whom Loki produced the great wolf Fenrir, as it is said in the older sources, and Snorre Sturluson in the 13th century added that Loki and Angrboda also had the Midgard serpent and the goddess Hel, produced from this union, but Snorre in here possibly was trying to link Loki with the Christian Satan as the father of demons and monsters. Still, the older sources speak of Angrboda as being the mother of wolves. Now, Hyrrokin is also related to wolves, as she is the giantess who came from Jotunheim, just like Angrboda, arriving on a giant wolf with vipers as reins or serpents. This Hyrrokin is related to both the symbol of the wolf and the serpent, just as Angrboda originally was, at least in relation to the wolf, and later on related to the world serpent, Jormungandr, as well. Now, there has been several attempts to link Gullveig with both Angrboda and Hyrrokin. It's true that both Hirokin and Angrboda have similarities, both giants from Jotunheimr and both linked to the wolf and the serpent. But nothing of the sort is said about Gullveig. Gullveig isn't related to the serpent or the wolf. However, she is related to the wolf and the serpent when she becomes Heidr. So it's funny because of all the made-up reasons and forced attempts to link Gullveig with these two other figures, no one has actually bothered to look for Heidr within the Voluspa. Let me show you again the translations. In stanza 22 of the Voluspa, it's about Heidr, and there is the specific part saying Voluvel spo, vitihon ganda. Henry Adams Bellows translated this as the wide-seeing witch in magic wise. There's another translation of this that goes like this, and I quote, "The witch who saw many things, she enchanted wands." Another, and finally, "A good seer of fair fortunes, she conjured spirits who told her." Now this last one seems to me to be way better in my opinion, and here's why. In the other two first translations, she is regarded as a witch, which isn't true at all, in the sense we have of the witch. Voluvel spo, not verspo as a unique word, but a clear break in here. Volu, in reference to Heidr being a volur, a volva. Therefore, a prophetess or seeress, and spo is divination, so a closer translation would be a good seeress, fair in divination. Then we have the second part. There is the term Ganda from Gandr. I've made a video where I have explored in more depth this Gandr as an helping spirit in Heidr. So please, if you have the time, do watch the video on helping spirits in Heidr, so I don't have to repeat myself and waste precious time. It is true that Ganda in this specific context is hard to translate. No doubt it is Gandr, and Gandr in the sources can be regarded as a unique type of magic, or the name of a wand, or a magic projectile, or a spiritual entity. But in this case, in this particular account, it seems unlikely that it is in reference to a wand, because the actual wand of the Volur, of the Seidkonur, the women practitioners of Seidr, is actually a gondul, from which the Gandr is sent forth, either the magical projectile, the mind of the sorcerer in animal form, a Fylgja, or it is the helping spirit with close parallels with the Sami Gandus. So it is a lot more likely that Heidr conjures spirits, Ganda in here in reference to the Gandir, the plural form of a Gandr, therefore helping spirits of the Volva, which the Volva contacts such spirits and from them receives prophecy. The curious thing about the Gandr or the Gandir, the plural form, is that they are often associated with wolves and serpents, finally. We have a particularly interesting account called Frostbreda Saga, and I quote, "I have caused Gandir to run far into the night, and I have now become wise about those things that I did not know before." This theme is very recurrent in relation to Heidr accounts, sending forth the Gandir, Gandr, as a helping spirit to obtain information, usually far off information. This has parallels with the Sami Gandus, the same helping spirit the Sami shaman, the Noaidi, sends forth to retrieve information for a client. The accounts on Heidr are filled with references to the Volva contacting the spirits, the Gandir helping spirits, and sending them forth to either obtain information, knowledge, or to cause effect on something or someone. Usually it's this Gandir that the Volva contacts for prophecy, helping spirits that aid the Volva in her prophecy, just like the helping spirits that aid the shaman. Please, seriously, watch my video on helping spirits in Heidr. It's very important, I think, to understand all of this, so I won't have to repeat myself. The point here is that these helping spirits are often associated with the wolf and the serpent. So in this aspect, both Angrboda and Hyrrokin are the figures of the Volva, connected to the wolf and the serpent as their helping spirits, as their Gandir. And Heidr conjures spirits. The new identity of Gullveig is a Volva, and she conjures spirits. She conjures helping spirits, to be more precise, the Gandir, seen in the Voluspa as Ganda for grammatical reasons, of course, obviously. In many sources, as I've pointed out on the video about helping spirits in Heidr, the Gandir spirits sometimes take animal form, which is found in a number of kennings, which I will probably place right here on the screen. The connections between wolves and sorcery in the role as the mounts of the female witch riders, such as Hyrrokin, which are very recurrent in the Old Norse written sources. Gandir appears to have been wolf spirits as well, as the conjured helping spirits of the Volva, of the Prophetess. And other animal forms are also recorded, such as the snake or the serpent. For example, the obvious kenning, Jormungandr, the mighty Gandr. The mighty spirit, the world serpent, is the Gandr, the helping spirit, mighty spirit of great power, just as Angrboda is connected to the Midgard serpent and Hyrrokin connected to those two snakes or serpents she uses as reins to ride the wolf. This is very curious because the Volva is said to possess a wand, which is often called the gondul, which means it has a phallic shape. The gondul is not the staff of the Volva. It is specifically a wand the Volva uses to conjure and send forth the Gandir, send forth the helping spirits. So the phallic shape of the wand can easily be associated with a similar shape of serpents. Hyrrokin uses the snakes as reins to ride the wolf. So in other words, she uses the wands, the gondul, to conjure the helping spirit, which is the wolf. And with the helping spirit, she rides, she flies, she moves. The shaman calls upon the helping spirits and rides them in the world of the spirits. In shamanism, we often have this idea that the shaman rides the spirits. There is always a sort of transportation used by the shaman to ride or move into the world of the spirits. So if Heidr conjures the Gandir, she conjures the helping spirits, she conjures them through the gondul, the wand, which is used to send forth the helping spirits. Therefore, Heidr is connected to both the wolf and the serpent as animals associated with these helping spirits in Heidr. The Gandir were animal spirits, mostly wolves and occasionally serpents, summoned possibly with the aid of a tool, the gondul, as I've said, and summoned during a Heidr performance. So it's not Gullveig that is related to the wolf and the serpent, because she is the maiden initiate. It's Heidr that is related to such animal symbols for being the Volva, the Prophetess, the Sorceress, who conjures spirits, Vitihon Ganda. But this doesn't mean that Gullveig/Heidr is the same as Angrboda and Hyrrokin. It means that all these female figures follow the same archetype, that of the Volva, the Old Norse Prophetess or Sorceress. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. I have certainly enjoyed researching this subject, and I must say that I actually almost died creating this whole thing because I was so immersed in it and all these conclusions popping up in my head that I have spent almost 48 hours researching without sleeping, without stopping, and I forgot to eat and drink. So you can imagine my condition by the end. The sacrifices I do for you. Luckily, I won't have to burn for you. I mean, some people already try to burn me on the online world with disgusting lies, but can't do much about it, can I? Doesn't matter what people have to say about me, because they don't actually know me. I'm the only one whose opinion about myself truly counts, because I am the only one who truly knows myself. And I have already completed several initiation processes, and every day there is a reason to learn something new. So, if you have reached this far, congratulations, and thank you so much for being in there and appreciating what I do. My deepest gratitude for supporting me and being with me until the end. This is without a doubt possibly the longest video I've ever done. Hopefully Gullveig-Heiðr will be pleased with this little offering in her honor. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. Don't forget the bibliography by the end of this video. And as always, tack för idag.